This is a University of Otago podcast.
Right, I think we'll make a start. Thank you everyone for coming along, which is for a fabulous occasion in the law faculty. It just gives me great pleasure to welcome back Colin Smith. And Michael Robertson and I were just talking about him in the lift before, how he was well known for his famous beard and his work at the Community Law Centre. And Rex Adar and I have been talking all week. We've been looking forward to this for weeks for you to come along. And Jeff Hall's got the dartboard out because you used to play darts with Jeff Hall quite a bit when you were here last time. As you'll know, Colin graduated with his LLB from the University of Otago in 1988. He's then worked in the Greymouth firm of Hannan and Seddon for 28 years. He's a loyal man. He's worked there for 28 years and was a partner in 1992, and he gave a great seminar to our students yesterday about working in a rural practice in a province, and it was a fantastic seminar. But Colin's not just been a lawyer. He's an active member of the Greymouth community, and last year, which we're all very proud of, he's awarded the MNSM, the Member of the New Zealand Order of Merit, in the New Zealand New Year Honours. And that was a lot to do with the work we're going to hear about today, but also the work you've done over many, many years. He's also received the New Zealand Law Kerry Goldstein Award for services to the community. He serves as the chairman of the Pike River Families Group Committee, we'll hear about it today, and the Pike River 29 Legacy Trust. He's also deputy chairman of Development West Coast. He's also served as chairperson of the West Coast Rugby Union. Great battlers over there. I thought they only played league over there. They do play a bit of rugby. And the Pararoa School Board of Trustees. He's a former trustee of the Big Brothers Big Sisters Trust, which is a great community organisation. Former district commissioner of the Western Pony Club, and very proud former president of the Dunedin Community Law Centre, which he was actively involved in for his whole 4 years here. We're very fortunate to have Colin here with us tonight to share his experience, his insight into the Pike River disaster, and he's come at his own cost. As a typical Colin, we're trying to force money upon him, but you know, he just wants to come at his own cost, which is fantastic. And the work he has done for the families and wider community, and most of us would have followed this through the media. It's been a tremendous disaster for the West Coast. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Colin to speak to us tonight about the Pike River and how could this happen in this day and age, and what lessons we can learn. Over to you, Colin.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Mark, for that introduction. It is a great pleasure to be here as a former student of Otago University. I'm right from the start, I want to thank Rex, who was the one who instigated this whole process. Rex came to Greymouth. He knew that I was working there. He touched base with me and we had lunch, and Rex actually talked about coming down to the university to talk to the students and also giving a lecture here today. So I want to thank Mark, you and the law faculty at Otago University for this opportunity. This is a topic that I'm extremely passionate about. It's a topic that's been a big part of my life for the last 5, almost 6 years, and it's a very, very important topic in New Zealand in terms of what's developed out of Pike and the reasons why it happened. Also, it's encouraging for me and also the families to see you people here tonight, because you've obviously come here tonight because you're interested in the subject, you're interested in learning about the subject, and that's very, very encouraging for me and also for the families. So thank you for taking the opportunity right at the start to come out and listen to us tonight. You'll see what you see up here in front of you. Can the lights, Lauren, be dimmed a little bit more?
Go for B.
Can everybody hear? Oh, that's better. That's better.
So just jump again. Is that all right?
Maybe go to, yeah, that's good. That's really good. Now, can everybody here see the mine plan here, which is the Pike River mine plan, overlaying over the territory, the topography in which the mine was developed? Can you see that there? Great, great. Okay. Now, when I talked to Lauren about giving this lecture, we talked about what was the most common question that people ask about the Pike River mine disaster? And I said to Lauren that wherever I go, the most common question I hear from people is, how could something like this happen in this day and age? And it's a fair question, and it's a question on a lot of New Zealand's public's lips. How could such a thing like this happen? Because we sort of think that this sort of disaster happens in third world countries, not in a developed country like New Zealand. Well, the aim tonight is to give you an understanding of how this did happen and how it could happen if a number of factors align at any one time. To understand or provide an answer to that question, you need to understand something of the basic terminology of coal mining, and you need to understand the risks that are associated with underground coal mining. So if we go back to the plan here, now the terminology that you most often hear with coal mining is you'll hear of the word portal, and the portal is the entrance to the mine, which is where the marker is now. Now if I go forward, there's the portal to the mine. So the portal is the entrance, and that's the entrance to the tunnel, which miners call the drift, which leads to the mine workings. Now, if you follow the arrow here, you'll see this tunnel is what the miners call the drift. And that's the tunnel that usually goes through rock and heads into the mine workings. And here you'll see the mine workings, which are made up of road headings, coal pillars, stoppings, etc., etc. So when I talk throughout this lecture about the portal, I'm talking about the opening. If I talk about the drift, I'm talking about the tunnel. And if I talk about the mine workings, then I'm talking about this area here. Now, the other important thing to understand about coal mining is methane. And methane is a really big issue in underground mines. Coal naturally, in underground seams, produces methane, which is a gas, and methane is lighter than air. So if you've ever seen a jar of water and oil and how the oil sits on top of the water, then methane acts the same way. So methane is lighter than air, and it travels to the top and sits above the air. So when you go back to the mine plan here, in the mine workings, in here, the roof of a mine is usually, it's never flat, and it has caverns, etc., etc. So if methane's not managed, methane collects in the top of the strata, and it collects up against the roof. And it's very, very important to control that. Now, methane's a natural product of coal mining, underground coal mining, and it's the one thing that has to be managed very, very carefully in a mine, because methane between the range of, and this is in a composition of air and gas, methane gas, if it's between 5 to 15%, then it's explosive. So at that range, if there's a spark in the mine, it will explode. Less than 5%, it's not explosive. More than 15%, it's not explosive. So it's in that range of 5 to 15% it is very, very dangerous. In terms of methane management, you'll often hear in mines the most important way of managing methane in a mine is by ventilation. So in an underground mine where the coal measures, when they're working the coal measures, the methane is naturally emitted from the seam. They are controlling the level of the methane in the mine to keep it below, in terms of the regulations, 1.25%. If it's in 1.25%, if it goes above 1.25%, all machinery has to stop. If it goes above 2%, the men must come out of the mine. If it goes to 5%, obviously you've got a real problem. Now, right from the start, I'll tell you, these men were working in conditions where they were still in the mine, and the range of gas at times was over 5%. They were still in the mine when the gas was over 2%. So gas management and management of the mine of methane is extremely important. Mines are classified by the gassiness, so there's a low gassy mine, mid and high gassy mine. Pike was a high gassy mine, so it was a very gassy mine. So methane management in Pike was extremely important. So as I go through this lecture, just remember that it's the control of methane in the mine that is the principal issue in keeping a mine safe, or the number one issue in any case. Now, this picture here, you'll see the main tube here going into the portal, into the mine drift. This is where they flume the fresh air into the mine. So they've got a main fan outside the mine, and they flume the air through these flumes through the flume here into the mine. So it's called forced ventilation. So the air is forced into the mine, and the foul air containing the methane is forced out of the mine. Now, the whole time that the boys were drilling this tunnel, which is 2.4 metres long from the portal right to the mine workings, they were working in what's called forced air ventilation. So they were working in the same tunnel where fresh air was being forced in and foul air was being forced out, which is not an ideal situation. So with that in mind, let's go back to the very beginning and how this all transpired. And the first critical step in the process of leading to this tragedy was when the government of the day in 1992-93 repealed the Coal Mines Act. Now, the Coal Mines Act was a piece of legislation that had been developed over 100 years. And it had been developed and improved and added to over 100 years from the first coal mining disaster in New Zealand, which was 1879, which was right in your back doorstep at Kaitangata. Now, from 1879 right through to the Brunner disaster, the Dobson disaster, the Huntley disaster, the Strongman disaster, the legislation kept getting improved. And so in 1979, we had an act called the Coal Mines Act, which was to regulate the coal mining industry. So as you can read from there, the title to the act says, "An act to consolidate and amend the law relating to coal prospecting and mining and to regulate the coal mining industry." That legislation was repealed and replaced, and just going back a step, that was very, very prescriptive legislation. So that was legislation that actually prescribed how the industry must operate in terms of mining and underground mining particularly. And it had a set of subordinate legislation such as regulations that were very specific, very direct in terms of what the mining industry had to do. The government at the time repealed that, and they replaced it with the Health and Safety and Employment Act. Now, this was non-prescriptive legislation. It was non-specific to the mining industry, and it was more general legislation. And it changed the focus from being prescriptive and prescribing what was to happen to putting an onus on the actual company to make sure that it took all practical steps. So a big change, a big switch. And this is where this is where the rot really started. This is what really set the scene for everything that followed on from there. Then, so we had this essential deregulation of the industry. Then, at the time of the Coal Mines Act, we had a very well-established mining inspectorate, and that was called the Mines Inspectorate, the Mines Inspectorate Group. It was made up of mechanical mining engineers, electrical mining engineers, and mining engineers themselves, and inspectors. So in this group, there had developed over a long period of time a lot of intellectual knowledge, and this group had a lot of expertise. In the deregulating sort of era of the 1990s, the government decided, as part of its cost-cutting exercises, to move the Mines Inspectorate from the Ministry of Commerce to the Department of Labour. Now, the Ministry of Commerce at the time was responsible for energy and resources. It was a focused ministry. So it went from a ministry focused on energy and resources to the Department of Labour. And what happened at the time, the engineers, the inspectors at the time, they argued extremely strongly to the government, do not move the Mines Inspectorate from the Ministry of Commerce to the Department of Labour, because they were concerned they were going to lose their identity and they would be absorbed into the general inspection activities of the Department of Labour. And unfortunately, their concerns were realised. In fact, in that one single move, that inspectorate lost a lot of its intellectual knowledge, because a lot of the inspectors and the engineers at the time decided, we're not having this, we're not going to be a part of this, so they resigned. And in one fell swoop, they lost a huge amount of intellectual knowledge. The inspectorate was then moved to the Department of Labour, and unfortunately, what those inspectors predicted actually happened. The inspectorate, obviously the Department of Labour had a whole lot of responsibilities across a whole range of activities. And so the inspectorate lost its identity, it lost a lot of resourcing, it lost a lot of its intellectual knowledge, and it became effectively under-resourced, understaffed, and unable to do its job in regulating this industry. So 2 factors already. Number one, we've lost the prescriptive legislation that controlled the industry. Number 2, we've lost a mines inspectorate that had a responsibility and capacity to properly regulate the industry. 2 really critical factors in really forming the groundwork as to how this tragedy could happen. So the path to the tragedy. With the deregulation, under the old regulations, the Mines Inspectorate used to, under the old legislation, the Mines Inspectorate used to follow the development of a mine from its very inception right through its design, its development, its production, and then its closure. And so through the life of the mine, those inspectors would be involved. And they're involved at every aspect, at every stage. And one of the most important aspects of that inspectorate was to ensure that the mine design was appropriate. And one of the fundamentals in underground coal mining is that you have 2 means of egress. So that if we go back to in the development of this mine, there is only one tunnel. There is only one access point or entry point or exit point to that tunnel. So if there's a disaster, and that is for whatever reason blocked or any other reason, then there's a real problem. So both internationally and under the regulations, the old regulations, there was a requirement. And under the regulations that carried on, in fact, there was a requirement for 2 means of egress. What happened here is the mine, for a whole lot of reasons, developing those 2 means of egress was a problem. one of the big problems was that in the initial development of this mine, they hadn't done the geological assessment that they should have done. They hadn't actually spent the money on investigating the mining prospect properly. So they were constantly coming up against situations that they couldn't predict because the geological information didn't give them that information. You'll see with this tunnel, there's 2.4 kilometres of tunnel. Now, most mines have an access of probably between 500 to 800 metres. Here you've got 2.4 k, and that tunnel was an extensive cost for the company. They had a number of issues in terms of the development of the tunnel, and that put cost pressures on them. And of course, putting in two drifts was going to be incredibly costly for the company. So they put in one drift, and then they were going to get around the two means of egress situation by putting in a vent shaft. And if you look at this particular plan here, the original plan was to put the vent shaft, this whole drift here is in rock. And the rock right up to this point had pretty good integrity. So the plan was to put the vent shaft, and you've all seen the vent shaft, you've seen the pictures of the flames coming out of the vent shaft at the top. Well, they were planning on putting the vent shaft in the drift in rock. And they were advised to do that. And the plan was to have two main fans on the surface. Because of their haste to produce coal, and because of the pressure on them to produce coal, they carried on, and they actually built the vent shaft here. Now, if you look at that plan, you can almost see a line. Can you see that line there? Well, that's the line of the Hawera fault, and that's an earthquake fault line. And either side of that fault line, there's a 100-metre crush zone. So the integrity of the rock in each of those zones is not good at all. So they, in their wisdom, built this ventilation shaft within that crush zone at significant cost. As a consequence, and as they'd been advised by a very, very experienced mines inspector, previous mines inspector, you're going to have real problems maintaining the integrity of that particular vent shaft. It collapsed. So not long after they completed the driving of the vent shaft, it actually collapsed. And of course, this caused significant delays in their progress in terms of getting to coal. It also caused significant additional unanticipated cost. So this started really putting cost pressure on the company. Next thing was financial issues. And if you look at this picture here, if you look at this is all the above ground infrastructure. Now they spent a huge amount on roading, bridging, building very eco-sensitive above ground structures, all very good and all very commendable. But the problem is, by the time they got to the development of the underground infrastructure, their financial situation started to deteriorate. And so the most important aspect of a mining operation is the development of the underground infrastructure. And by the time they got to the development of the underground infrastructure, they were suffering serious financial issues. They'd had a major collapse in the vent shaft, which cost something like $20 additional million. They had major time overruns as a consequence. Because of the lack of geological investigation, they got into the coal and they were driving forward, and suddenly they hit a rock face again. And the geological information hadn't shown them the rock, that they were going to hit rock again. And it's called a graben, which comes up and intrudes through the seam. So they're getting into coal, they're thinking they're on the road, and bang, they're into rock again. Again, cost increases, time delays, pressure increasing. And from this point on in the tragedy, financial issues reared their heads very, very significantly. Also, as part of the fact that we've only got one means of egress and essentially no ventilation system, and if I can just take you a step back, if you, to give you an idea of how important ventilation is, if you in your flat or in your house open your front door and don't open your back door, you don't get a ventilation circuit, do you? You don't get airflow. But if you open the door at the front of the hallway and the door at the back of the hallway, you'll get a really good airflow. And that, put simply, is a ventilation circuit. And that, put simply, is what they needed to do to ensure their ventilation in the mine was effective. And what happened was, and I'll just take you back to the plan, because of the cost overruns and the pressures that were now on the mine, they were planning on pushing a second means of egress from the end of the mine workings here out to an escarpment. They had so much pressure on them to produce coal, they stopped the mining to put that in place, and they pulled the gear back to here, and they started a hydro mining operation, which produces a heck of a lot of methane. So instead of completing the circuit, so where you had fresh air coming into the mine here, and foul air coming out through the escarpment here, which would have been an excellent ventilation system, because of the pressures and overruns, they stopped that and they came back and they started developing this underground hydro mining exercise, which only compounded the methane management and ventilation issues. So the whole thing is really starting to compound for them now terribly. The lack of oversight by the inspectorate of this mine, and we're still in the development phase, but we're starting to head towards a production phase. The lack of inspectorate oversight of this mine development led to some really significant issues, particularly in terms of ventilation. And to give you an idea of how significant these issues were becoming, miners, and these particular things like frictional ignition, these were being reported to the inspectorate, and the inspectorate wasn't acting on them. So frictional ignition, the methane, lighter than air, is building up along the top of the tunnel. They're mining at the face, and when they're mining in coal, every now and again you get a bit of rock outcrop, and the teeth on the miner were striking rock and causing sparks. Now the methane was layering over the machine as they were working forward. These sparks were setting the methane off, and they were getting flame firing over the top of the machine. They had 12 incidences of frictional ignition reported to the inspectorate, and nothing was done. They had the effect of the ventilation in the mine was becoming so critical that underground workers were coming home at night suffering from headaches, suffering from nausea. They were complaining to their families about it. One mother was telling me that her son couldn't eat his tea at night because he was so nauseous from working in the mine. So these ventilation issues were really starting to compound. One of the reasons why, there's a multitude of reasons why they weren't dealing with the ventilation properly. One, they didn't have a proper circuit in the mine. Two, they didn't have proper gas monitoring systems. It's absolutely essential in an underground mine that you have a real-time gas monitoring system. And by real-time, it means you have sensors strategically placed right throughout the mine that are reading the gas levels instantaneously. And so the mine information, the gas information is coming from the mine to the control room and is being monitored consistently. And the system that is most regularly used internationally is called a MIAC system. They didn't have it. This was supposedly a state-of-the-art mine, and they didn't even have a real-time gas monitoring system. It's unbelievable, and it goes on. In the last 2 weeks before the explosion, they effectively had 4 sensors underground. One in the hydro panel, which was a very high methane producing operation. They had 2 in the drift, and in the return, which is where the foul air comes out. So, and then they had 1 at the bottom of the vent shaft. If I take you back, they had 1 at the bottom of the ventilation shaft. So they had, in the hydro panel here, they had 1 sensor here. They had 1 sensor in the return, so this is the turn air, so the fresh air is coming in the drift here, and it's going through the mine, and the foul air is coming out through this return airway here, and then being forced out through the vent shaft here. Now they had 1 sensor in the workings, 1 in the return, 1 at the bottom of the vent shaft, and 1 at the top of this vent shaft. 2 weeks before the explosion, the monitor, the only underground sensor that was working was the 1 at the bottom of the vent shaft, and that was flatlining at about 2.96%. So it was flatlining above the point at which the men should have been out of the mine. They had another sensor at the top of the vent shaft, but as you can expect, there's a mixing of atmosphere and gas up here that makes that less critical than the sensors that are in the mine. So for the last 2 weeks, they didn't even have effective monitoring of the gas levels in the mine. And they had a mine manager by the name of Doug White, who was an ex-acting Chief Inspector of Mines in Queensland, and he was managing this mine. And he came from a very highly prescriptive mining industry in Australia to a non-descriptive industry here. Why did he not stop that mine? Why did he say, this shuts down until we've got this sorted out? He didn't. Another factor that led to the tragedy. Hopefully you can see how these are starting to build up. And so you've got all these issues with the ventilation, with the mine design, the lack of inspection and regulation, and all this is starting to build. Overlaying this, you actually had a management structure which was made up basically of Australians and South Africans. Now, no disrespect to Australians and South Africans, but underground coal mining in New Zealand is very, very challenging. Geologically, we have a lot of fault and uplift effect on coal seams. In Australia, the coal seams are basically long, flat, wide coal seams, often under paddocks. Here, as you can see with this mine here, it's actually developed in a very, very steep mountainous country. And it's faulted, it's uplifted, and so it's very, very challenging geologically. It's also very, very challenging to manage. So you've got Australian and South African managers who don't have an understanding of actually managing a coal mine in a New Zealand environment. Don't have the experience, have a lack of experience of managing mines in that particular situation. You had a very high turnover of managers. There's something like, I just can't remember the figures, but the turnover was significant. So you had managers coming and going. You had technical managers coming and going. You had geologists coming and going. So there was no continuity of oversight in terms of the development of the mine. There was a workplace culture where what management said went. Management did not listen to the men at the coalface underground. It was one directional. It was from management down. The men underground were regularly putting in incident reports, gas incident reports with machinery underground, etc., etc. Do you know that 2 weeks before the mine exploded, they had such a backlog of incident reports that management hadn't dealt with that they actually wrote them off. They didn't check them, they wrote them off. So all that evidence and information that the men from underground had been feeding up through incident reports, etc., was just totally ignored by management. So you can see management weren't through their own lack of oversight, weren't getting a significant indication of the situation underground because of their own negligence, not the negligence of the guys underground. So, and you also had a culture where there was quite a lot of bullying, particularly from the top. You had a leader who was essentially a micromanager who basically managed on the basis it's my way or the highway. If you don't like it, you know where you can go. So the communication essentially between management and workers was extremely poor, and that also led to some very, very poor decision making. And that was a management issue, not a worker issue. Another problem was because they were Australian managers, they bought in machinery that was effective in Australian underground mining, where you were mining flat, your machinery was working on a flat surface, working on a coal seam that just went straight ahead for kilometres in a flat situation. They brought this machinery into Pike, and it was just ineffective. Because of the very challenging environment, it was a very wet mine, so there were a lot of issues with damp and the operation of the machines. They were underpowered because of the drift here. If we go back to the mine here, the drift was actually a rising drift. So it rose about 1 in 11. So it was rising all the way up here. And the mine workings, this was pit bottom, which means it's the lowest point in the mine, and it's rising again from here. So this machinery, which was developed to work on flat, even surfaces, just wasn't cutting the mustard. And of course, that caused all sorts of operational issues. The men were constantly complaining about machinery breaking down, machinery not being available, and it caused all sorts of production issues. It caused frustration amongst the workforce. They were incredibly frustrated because they couldn't produce on a continuous basis. It was constantly breaking down, and that led to morale issues. So it's continuing to compound in the mine. There was a lack of experience underground because at the time this mine was developed, coal mining was booming, and it was booming internationally. So there's a very, very high demand on qualified mine personnel, such as deputies, underviewers, mine managers. And so this mine had a real problem attracting the expertise it needed. And the people it needed. And in fact, if I take you forward to the men, of those 29 men in that shift, there were 5 experienced miners. And when I say 5 experienced miners, there were 5 of them that had more than 2 years' experience in a coal mine. In the old days, you didn't even get to the coalface until you'd had 2 years' experience. So you had a workforce that lacked the combination of experienced to inexperienced miners so that it could be properly supervised underground. And in fact, in one area of the mine, 3 of the experienced miners were all working in what they called the hydro panel. So you've got 29 men working right through this mine, and 3 of the 5 experienced guys are working in the one area. Unbelievable. And so this was all starting to compound to produce production problems. And they were having real problems getting the coal out, and getting the coal out in a volume that enabled them to satisfy the costs and also satisfy the shareholders. The shareholders of the company were really starting to grumble now. And of course the directors were really focused on the shareholders because the shareholders wanted a return and they wanted production. They wanted to see that this mine was actually in a continuous production state. It never got to that, never got to a continuous production state. In fact, it really never got to a proper production state before the explosion. So significant production problems through poor ventilation, poor underground management, lack of experience, problems of ventilation, etc., etc. All starting to compound in terms of the operation of this mine. So the tragedy. Hopefully in the last 20, 30 minutes, you started to see how this progressed from the government's change in legislation, through the lack of inspection and regulation, through the production issues, through the issues of management, issues of development of the mine, design of the mine, etc., etc. It all started to compound. There was an absolute litany of failures. There were failures in every area of the development of this mine. Unbelievable. In fact, it's such a significant failure that internationally they use Pike River Mine now as a case study for mining engineering students around the world. This is an example of how you do not do it. And that's an absolute tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy that this happened. It was totally avoidable. Totally avoidable. And there was a specialist we worked with who was, I think they call him a process health safety consultant, something along those lines. And she talked about the Swiss cheese theory. And that is, you get a block of Swiss cheese, and it's not very often the holes in a block of Swiss cheese line up. And when you get major catastrophic disaster like this, it's when you get that lineup of holes. Because generally there's something along the process that actually stops that disaster happening. Here, if the regulator had been effective and done its job, it would have stopped this tragedy in its tracks. If the management had been effective in the mine, it would have stopped it in its tracks. If the directors had had proper oversight of the management of the mine and actually taken an interest in the health and safety of the workers in the mine, it would have stopped the disaster. A whole lot of different steps would have stopped this. But unfortunately, all those holes lined up, and that's what led to this tragedy. No one single factor, the combination of the factors right from the start. And in my view, and this is a personal view, in my view there was one main component that could have stopped this in its tracks right at the beginning, and that was the government changing the legislation and dismantling the inspectorate and rendering the regulator ineffective. That would have stopped this tragedy in its tracks. So, from the disaster, where to? Initially, the company led the families to believe there was an opportunity that the boys would come out alive. And that went on for 4 days. For 4 days, the company led the families to believe that their men were coming out. The New Zealand experienced miners were saying, and they were pleading with the incident controllers to seal the mine, because it was well known by the miners with the experience, if those boys were not out in 24 hours, they were gone. There was no hope for them. They had to seal the mine to stop it bursting into fire, and then there was a chance of possible recovery of the bodies. Despite the pleading with the authorities ignored it. They went on and allowed this mine to explode again and again and again. 4 times it exploded. By the 4th time, and I'll go back to the plan here, by the 4th time, right in here was where the drift entered the mine, they had a major roof collapse. So the roof caved in and blocked the workings. That effectively rendered recovery of the men extremely difficult. Some mining engineers saying impossible, others saying it can still be done. But that is one of the major issues in terms of recovery of the men. So they should have sealed the mine when they were told by the New Zealand experts, but they didn't. By about a week after the tragedy, I had become involved because, and I'll go forward here, I'd become involved because this young man here, Michael Monk, was my nephew. And that brought me headfirst into the tragedy. From a personal perspective, but also in a professional perspective. Because I could see that what was happening with the families is the families in a disparate group were asking questions and asking for information, trying to find out answers. They weren't getting the answers. And I could see that if we didn't get the families to join together and form a group, we weren't going to get the information. We weren't going to get traction. We weren't going to be able to make a difference. So Bernie Monk, who's Michael's father, who was also spokesman of the Families Group Committee, I said to Bernie, listen, we've got to get the families together. We've got to unite them, and we've got to organise so that we can actually work effectively as a group, because individually we're not going to be effective. So we then, with the help of the CTU at the time, formed the Pike River Families Group Committee. And then we started to get some traction in terms of getting information from the authorities, in terms of getting some traction, in terms of helping the families start to understand what had happened here. From there, we then knew that one of the principal things we needed to achieve was that something like this never, ever happens again. So the families fought long and hard through the Royal Commission, also through select committee stages, and also direct communication with ministers of the Crown, fought to see change in terms of the health and safety regime in New Zealand. And we made extensive submissions on the Health and Safety Reform Bill, and I'm pleased to say if there's one area that the families have been effective or have achieved their aim, it is in terms of the change in health and safety legislation in New Zealand with the new Act. And that's been a major achievement. But one thing we haven't been able to achieve in 5 years of fighting is to effectively get justice. And this is an issue that is still burning very, very deeply with the families. Understandably, we had the company prosecuted and we had the company pay compensation, which was effectively the insurer paying the compensation, not the company. The company was a shell. It was in liquidation. It was an absolute shell. So there's no real recognition in that at all. Valley Longwell were charged as a driller, underground driller, but again, the principal players in terms of this tragedy, the people all along the way who could have stopped this tragedy happening, none of them had been brought to justice. When the prosecution against Peter Whittle as CEO was dropped, that was a major blow to the families. And to this day, the majority of the families do not feel as though they have had justice. And they haven't had justice. No individual person in terms of this tragedy has been brought to justice. And it's not only individual people in the tragedy. Remember, the government has had a big part to play in setting the scene to this tragedy. The government, the government through its department, the Department of Labour, was significantly negligent in their failure to properly oversee the development and management of this mine. Board of Directors, nobody in the Board of Directors has been charged. They had a principal part to play. Nobody in the management was charged. They had a principal part to play. So the families feel that no real justice has been achieved. And in fact, when the Hillsborough families recently finally got recognition through the courts that they weren't in the wrong and that it was the police in the wrong, that gave the families hope that if they continue their fight, they will one day get recognition.